Bible is, in fact, unique. And you can just imagine back in the day that people were sitting around saying things like, well, why would anybody ever accept a book that's the same as the other guy's book? It took, in fact, about 50 years for these hand decorations and these customizations to go out of fashion. So by 1488, we have here the Flores Astrologiae. This is an astronomical text, and you can see here that they have gotten away from hand decoration, no color in here. What they've done is instead they've dropped in woodcuts for the drop caps, and the pictures are woodcuts that are dropped into the text. So you sort of leave space for the illustration and then drop it in there as you're going along. This is, at this point, at 1488, pretty recognizable to me as a standard book. So the conventions that we now live by are, at this point, in place. We have standardization of the text. We leave space for graphics. We sort of have some vertical space above and below them. No page numbers yet. And so from 1488, since we want to bring this back around to technical writing, we jump all the way to the 1930s and to the Singer Featherweight manual. So after 400 years of print, this is what we have, and I think it's sort of distressing almost to look at this and to see how really closely that does actually resemble what was done in those early books. So we have something like 500 years of history explaining to us or dictating to us the conventions of how things are created. Here we have a 60s typewriter manual. One thing to note here is that you have photos and you have those boxes in the photos for call-outs, which are helping you to focus in on the bit of information that that particular author wanted you to focus on. So let's go back and do a little compare and contrast here. We look at the Book of Kells on the left and a page from the Gutenberg Bible on the right. Clearly we have an art versus a craft. We have drop caps on the right in an attempt to sort of spice things up and make it look a little bit more interesting. And actually we have a much more dense presentation of content. There are clearly a lot more words on the page on the right than there are on the page on the left. On the other hand, the page on the left is a lot more fun to look at. So we give up art, we move more into a craft, and I guess the question then is, what did we get for it? What did this buy us, leaving behind the artistic achievements of the monks that wrote the Book of Kells and some of these other things? And the answer lies here. Before Gutenberg, the estimate is there were approximately 30,000 books in all of Western Europe. And by 50 years later, so around 1500, the estimate is there were 10 to 12 million books. So the books are less attractive, but they're obviously far more accessible to everybody because there were far more of them and the cost of producing them had dropped so tremendously. So what are the implications of that? What are the implications of the rise of available books? The winners, after Gutenberg came along, were printers. The job of being a printer did not exist before 1452, and certainly within 50 years or so, there were print shops in every city. Literacy, because it was so much easier to produce text, it became so much easier for people to get their hands on text, which then made it possible to learn to read. Information became accessible because, again, it wasn't locked up literally in a church or a monastery or a prince's house, but because books became feasible for the middle class or the upper middle class, they became more accessible. And finally, newspapers. The interesting thing about newspapers is they did not actually come along until approximately 150 years after Gutenberg, but most scholars think that newspapers were, in fact, the most important winner after Gutenberg, the rise of news being distributed on a daily or a weekly basis. Losers after Gutenberg. Well, there were two jobs that became obsolete, the job of the scribe and the job of the illuminator. The scribe was the person who hand-copied text, and the illuminator was the person who added color and drop caps and those Celtic knots we were looking at earlier. By about 1500, the job of the illuminator was basically gone, and the job of the scribe was essentially limited to copying things like legal documents where you only needed maybe 2 copies, where it was cost prohibitive to actually put it up on a press. So scribes went away, illuminators went away. Censorship became much, much, much more challenging because it became so much more difficult to restrict the flow of information because books were inexpensive or less expensive and easier to distribute. And the implication of that was that as information flowed more freely, political control became more difficult. Now, there is a school of thought that says that the Protestant Reformation might not have happened without the printing press because the information could have been suppressed. I don't take a position on that, but I think it's something very interesting to think about. So let's take a look at the publishing workflows that were changed first by Gutenberg and later by the rise of XML that we have today, and what actually happened from the point of view of how your work gets done. And there are 3 major things that are happening in both cases that I want to take a look at. First, we have the separation of roles and responsibilities. If you go back and think about a hand-copied manuscript, then the act of reproducing the manuscript, the act of formatting the manuscript, and the act of producing the content for the manuscript are all in one activity. That person sitting at a desk hand-copying the manuscript is also formatting, is also reproducing. When you introduce printing technology, what happens is that you separate out the process of reproduction. Content and formatting are still combined in the process of typesetting, but reproduction is now separated from that process and can be done as a separate activity. And when we move to XML, we complete that separation because now content is in one layer or in one activity, formatting is in the second activity, and reproduction is in the third activity. So we have now completely separated those 3 pieces of the text production process or the document production process. And that is an important reason why in every case we had significant economic impact, because anytime you separate these things, you gain the ability to instill efficiencies into those various things. Now, if we take a look at formatting in the 1980s, this was sort of the traditional pre-single sourcing approach. You format and produce the print, you format and produce the HTML, and for any sort of translations, you would also have to format and produce print and HTML again, sort of repeatedly. Now, we took a step towards separating those things with single sourcing, but with XML, what's going to happen is that you have your XML, and the XML understands that it is, in fact, not necessarily print, HTML, or anything else. It's just content.